Well, hello everyone. This is Barry Jones with SP History, and today we are doing episode 2 in the Miami series. Episode 1, I told the story of how and why so many Cuban refugees came to South Florida in the early 60s and what their composition was or what their makeup was as far as their mentality. They were very revolutionary, anti-Castro people. They did not want to permanently live in South Florida or Miami. Their intention was to launch a counter-revolution against Castro's revolution so they could get rid of him and go back home. That was the goal. So when all of these Cuban militants descend on South Florida and Miami, it's with the intention of organizing with whatever forces they could to help them get back home. And so they're going to be very willing, very motivated, very hostile towards Castro and his government, very open to working with other entities that they might meet here in the States that are also motivated to get rid of Castro. And that's going to make Miami a tempest in a teapot, so to speak, because this is where all these forces are going to come together and join together, merge their efforts. And so I in episode 1 gave you a partial list, but a list that should give you a good beginning understanding of what kind of people from Cuba were coming to Miami. These were mostly young, male, military age, very revolutionary, very willing and motivated to die for the cause. And so they were not looking to come here and assimilate and create a little Havana necessarily, although that's what happened. They were coming here to lick their wounds and figure out another way to get rid of Castro. So it was always meant to be temporary. Today, I want to look into some of the folks that they met when they came here that will later contribute to their efforts and to their cause. That will become part of the partnership to get rid of Castro. And so today we're going to focus on organized crime and the organized crime elements or figures also in Miami that also have reason to want to get rid of Castro. And of course, you can't talk about the South Florida organized crime family without talking about Santos Trafficante, pictured here at the top. Also at the bottom here, sitting there at a dinner, very famous photograph of him in the red circle, sitting next to Carlos Marcello on his right, our left, as we look at the picture. And his attorney is at the head of the table, Frank Regano, wrote a famous book called Mob Lawyer. Frank Regano was in a unique position to know a lot of the communication goings on between all of these forces down in South Florida, because this is how a lot of these people communicated back and forth with each other. They used attorneys, especially the mafiosos, because attorney-client privilege, they felt safe telling their attorney to communicate a message to somebody, so that they didn't have to be in the same room together. They didn't have to be face to face. They communicated through these attorneys. Frank Regano was one such attorney. So anyway, that's the story of Santos Trafficante begins. He was the boss. In of course, if you're watching this, you already know organized crime had a sweetheart deal with Batista, the former president of Cuba, and he wasn't the only one. CIA had a sweetheart deal with him. A lot of U.S. companies had a sweetheart deal with. Cuba under Batista was basically a wholly owned subsidiary of the United States interests, whether legitimate or otherwise. And as soon as he was overthrown by Castro, one of the first things Castro did is throw out all the mafiosos and nationalize all the big companies and industries, kick out the U.S. businesses, and stop the heroin trade that the CIA had been profiting from for years, running through Cuba. So he just cut off he cut off the ATM machine, basically, the United States. And so, of course, the United States is going to have a lot of reasons to want to get rid of Castro. Well, one of the things Castro did was to round up all of the people that had been uh, opposed to him taking power. And of course, one of those happened to be Santos Trafficante. So he had him arrested, and he was actually scheduled to be executed. Santos Trafficante was. And so the mafiosos back in the States decided, we got to save our guy. And so they sent their guy, Jack Ruby, who, along with Lee Harvey Oswald, got on a plane in the Keys, witnessed by people getting on that plane in the Keys. This is one of the first and the earliest instances where Jack Ruby and Oswald were seen together. And they went to Cuba to rescue their guy, Santos Trafficante. And the way that they persuaded Castro was, we helped you win the revolution by running guns to you. Of course, we ran guns to your enemy as well, to Batista, but we were playing both sides, and you did get guns and ammunition from us. So we're appealing to you, based on our prior help and our prior relationship with you, to at least let Santos go. We'll take him out of your country. You won't have to worry about him. We'll take him back to Florida. Now, Castro smartly extracted something from Santos in exchange for his freedom and for his life, and that was that he would act as a spy in Miami or in Florida for Castro going forward. He knew he was going to have a problem with these refugees. He knew he was going to have a problem with the United States government. He needed somebody, and of course, it's going to be a pretty vast network of spies. They call it the WASP network. Castro always knew this is why Bay of Pigs didn't work, because he knew it was coming. He always knew when all these assassination attempts were coming because of his double agents, one of which was Santos Trafficante and all his spies in Miami. So Santos Trafficante will come back to the States, rescued by his organized crime partners and Jack Ruby and Lee Harvey Oswald, and he will become a major player going forward because the CIA sees potential in somebody who's been mistreated by Castro, somebody who is the boss over all these Cuban refugees. He's got this ready-made army at his disposal. He would be perfect. If we could get him on our side to help overthrow Castro, he would be perfect. So he will become very much involved in Operation 40, Operation Mongoose, which are pretty much one and the same. Also the S-Force, which is the sort of the personal jihad by Richard Nixon to assassinate Castro. He's involved in all of them because there's all this talk about the partnership between organized crime and the CIA. Well, it was really between the CIA and Santos Trafficante. And because Santos Trafficante has partners in organized crime, like up in Chicago and in New York and in New Orleans and stuff, they by default become part of it as well. But really, only one of the organized crime figures has at his disposal all these Cubans that are his personal army. Once he leaves Cuba and comes to the States and sets up shop in Florida, all of these Cubans that came with him, he's a refugee too, right? It's like a Venn diagram. You got circle A, which are all the Cubans. You have circle B, which are organized crime. And then you have the intersecting part in the middle, which is section C, and that's the folks that fill both categories. Yeah, he's Cuban, but he's also organized crime. Yeah, he's organized crime, but he's also Cuban. So they're like two heads of the same coin, right? And that's Santos. So he becomes the key player in this marriage between the CIA and organized crime going forward, and of course the Cubans, because it's his Cubans. He himself is Cuban. And since he's an organized crime figure to boot, and he has control over all these Cubans. And if you're going to assassinate Castro, you got to do it with Cubans. You can't do it with white guys from Chicago. They're not going to blend into Cuba. So you're going to have to use Santos's people, which means organized crimes people, which means Cubans, to do it. They're going to become the foot soldiers. So Santos is, I cannot overstate the importance of Santos Trafficante in all things related to CIA or U.S. government uh, operations to get rid of Castro or assassinate Castro. Santos is right smack in the middle of it. He's the guy that has to control the Cubans, and he's the guy whose Cuba is his territory. So hugely important going forward. And of course, as we not only is he partnering with the CIA and all these, he's also partnering with Castro. Is becoming, he's the double agent in Miami. He's the spy. So he's reporting back to Castro everything that is happening with his other relationship on the side of the CIA. All of these operations to kill and assassinate, overthrow Castro. Castro knows about it the same, before it happens. That's why they never worked. And of course, he's got all these partners spread across the country, right? When you're in organized crime, it's organized because you're working together and you're splitting up the country into territories and things. So he's got Sam Giancana as a partner up in Chicago. He's got Carlos Marcel as a partner in New Orleans, Peter Licavoli in Detroit, the five families in New York, and Jimmy Hoffa. You say, well, what's Jimmy Hoffa? He's the leader of a Teamster union. That's a legitimate union. He's not an organized crime. Jimmy Hoffa is as much an organized crime figure as any of these other guys. It was his money from his Teamsters pension fund. It was building Las Vegas for all these organized crime figures. And so they were using his money and some of his muscle. They were working together. Hoffa's making money off organized crime. Organized crime's making money off Jimmy Hoffa because they're building Las Vegas, which is going to be the new Cuba. So they're working together. So, and of course, Jimmy Hoffa is a very well-known opponent or enemy of the Kennedy brothers. Hates the Kennedys. Absolutely hates them. Bobby's trying to put him in prison. Just can't stand the Kennedys. It's a funny story. In 1960, when organized crime decided to help, they made a deal with Joe Kennedy to help JFK become president. The word went out to all these partners, we got to do everything we can to help Kennedy win the election. We've made a deal. And that included Jimmy Hoffa. And Hoffa was just fit to be tied. Well, just him. Carlos Marcello couldn't stand the Kennedys either. But like they say in the movies, business is business. And the decision was made that their future, if the deal was upheld, if the deal went through, if they got Kennedy elected and he upheld his part of the bargain, they would be better off with Kennedy as president than they would be with Nixon, even though Nixon, they pretty much owned him as well. But there's some interesting reasons why Kennedy would be even more advantageous. And so they had to literally, guys like Jimmy Hoffa and Carlos Marcelo had to swallow hard and participate in this partnership, this deal to help Kennedy get elected in 1960. But once Kennedy gets elected and they've done their part of the deal, they have expectations that now Kennedy's going to do his part of the deal. Which, if you remember, and I did a whole series on the Kennedy family and organized crime, the deal was twofold. A, you'll have a friend in the White House, which means the Justice Department will leave you alone. And B, you'll have a guy in the White House who will be as committed as you are to getting rid of Castro. So if he upholds those two things, organized crime sees a future, like this unlimited future to make money in the United States, not having to worry about government interference, not having to worry about being prosecuted, not having to worry about testify at these commission hearings, and being able to operate in Cuba just like they had been. So, of course, we all know Kennedy's going to renege on that part of the deal. And that's what's going to turn these partners, these organized crime partners, and Jimmy Hoffa against the Kennedys. In 60, he was still a blank slate. By the time we get to 63, they figured out Kennedy no longer is interested in getting rid of Castro. And he has not been a friend in the White House. Bobby Kennedy, as Attorney General, has gone after us harder than he did before. In other words, they double-crossed us. They got out of us what they needed, which was to get elected, but they didn't give back their part of the deal. And now there are people in this world, entities in this world, organizations in this. What is wrong with the internet? My internet keeps going in and out. I don't know why, but it blinks on, blinks off. So hopefully this is recording. It hasn't blinked off on me yet, but anyway, so as I said, there are entities in this world, there are organizations in this world, there are people in this world you can double cross. Organized crime is not one of them. And so we have evidence, hard evidence, documented evidence. The FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover knew that organized crime was not happy by the time we get to 63 with JFK. And in fact, knew that they were planning to kill him or knew of a plan to kill him. This is why J. Edgar Hoover is just as complicit in the JFK assassination as Allen Dulles and the rest of these conspirators, because he had foreknowledge. He knew in advance. It was his job to know. These were his wiretaps. Here's one of them. Trafficante is speaking to an associate to talk about Jimmy Hoffa, who's one of them. He says, quote, have you seen how his brother, talking about Bobby, is hitting Hoffa, a man who is a worker, who is not a millionaire, a friend of the blue collars? He doesn't know that this kind of encounter is very delicate. It is not right what they're doing to Hoffa. Hoffa is a hardworking man and doesn't deserve it. Mark my words, this man Kennedy is in trouble. Talking about the president, and he will get what is coming to him. And so why is he talking about, how do you know he's talking about John, the president, when earlier in the quote, he's talking about Bobby? And this is because Carlos Marcello and another FBI wiretap sort of betrays the game when he says, if you cut off the tail of a dog, the dog will still be a problem. But if you cut off the head, the dog will cease to be a problem. And that's this analogy they're using is to describe why they chose to kill JFK instead of Bobby, at least initially, because Bobby was not the president. JFK was the president. If you kill Bobby, JFK as president, in revenge for having killed his brother, that will move heaven and earth against organized crime, and their problem will just get worse. But if you kill JFK, Bobby is pretty much out as Attorney General, and now it's like killing two with one stone. So we know who their target is. And when this associate disagrees with Trafficante, he says, what do you mean Kennedy's in trouble? He's going to win re-election in 64 easy. He's misunderstanding what Trafficante is saying. Trafficante clarifies, and he says, you don't understand me. Kennedy's not going to make it to the election. He's going to be hit. This is an FBI wiretap out of Miami prior to the JFK assassination that J. Edgar Hoover was privy to. He knew about it. He knew what these folks, these heavy hitters, that he liked. You know, J. Edgar Hoover liked to say, well, there's no such thing as organized crime. There's no mafia. There's no Cosa Nostra. He knew full well there was. He was covering for Cosa Nostra. He was covering for organized crime. He was covering for the mafia because he had his own, they had compromise on him as well. They had leverage over him because of his gambling debts and his homosexual lifestyle. So he covered for the mafia, but he didn't mean he didn't know what they were up to. Like I said, he had actual wiretaps, quotes from them about what they were up to. So Santos Trafficante is a very key player in this whole organized crime environment down in Miami. Another one is Meyer Lansky. Meyer Lansky got his start in organized crime back in 1920, met Bugsy Siegel, Lucky Luciano. These are heavy hitters in organized crime. They weren't in 1920, they were just young guys. And they got involved in their own gang, and they were doing bootlegging and protection rackets and, scratching out a living kind of a thing. And they were all working for the New York boss, was Joe Masseria. And in 1931, these guys got together with Albert Anastasia, and they said, we're going to kill. This is how the succession works in organized crime. You kill the boss, and then one of you in the conspiracy ascends to the throne, becomes the new boss, until somebody comes along and kills you. This is sort of how it works. So in 31, they took out Masserio. Now, Lansky was not eligible to be the boss because this is an Italian gang. He's Jewish. Of course, they have rules about You have to be from the home country, Italy, Sicily, whatever. So that elevates Lucky Luciano, Albert Anastasia. Bugsy ends up partnering with Lansky and going out to New Orleans and starting casinos. Lansky moves down to Florida and takes over the territory of Florida, New Orleans, and Cuba, and but uh, not as a boss. He goes down there as sort of an emissary of the New York family and establishes a beachhead for the New York family down in the South, primarily out of Miami, where he had a home, and he was the sole investor, the primary investor in Miami National Bank, which means he's the operator of Miami National Bank. And that bank ends up becoming sort of the laundromat of all things organized crime coming out of New York and his operations down in Miami. That becomes the way to launder money. Uh, it's one thing Meyer Lansky was really good at was numbers. He was a genius with numbers. If you watched any of my Chauncey Holt series, I talk about that in detail about how Lansky had a numbers racket up in Baltimore. He had a numbers racket going down in Miami. That was really what he was good at. And so he was good at organization too. He helped organize the New York family into what we, from a disorganized crime to an organized crime outfit to a syndicate, split territories amongst 5 families, et cetera, et cetera. Meyer Lansky's responsible for all that. And then he takes that skill and he puts it to good use for his friends, for his partners, making money for everybody, uh, laundering money, hiding money, shifting money around, helping with investments and this and that. He took that expertise, which was sort of legitimate, right? And he added a layer of legitimacy to an illegitimate outfit because of his skills with money. And so he's operating out of Miami, running this Miami National Bank, and his partner, Bugsy Siegel, went out and started the Flamingo with Meyer Lansky's cash. So Meyer Lansky becomes the major investor in this new hotel. He sends Bugsy, who he trusts, out to start this Flamingo, but then he starts getting wind of the fact, he starts to suspect anyway, that a lot of the money he's sending out to build the Flamingo is disappearing and being spent by Bugsy Siegel or stolen by Bugsy Siegel. So he ends up, and Chauncey Holt tells this story, he and Chauncey, who, by the way, Chauncey Holt got recruited by Meyer Lansky because of his same skill with numbers. He was a genius when it came to numbers. And so Meyer was always on the lookout for another guy who was good with numbers. So he recruits Chauncey Holt into his organization. And Meyer Lansky's actually the guy that got Chauncey Holt working for both organized crime and the CIA. And so anyway, that's another story. But so they go out to the Flamingo to Las Vegas to see for themselves if Bugsy Siegel is stealing from them. And they figure out pretty quick that he is. All this money he's saying he's paying the contractors. They're talking to the contractors, and the contractors saying, no, he didn't pay us that at all. You still owe it. So they realize he's stealing. So they confront him. He gets real belligerent. And so the rest of the partners order a hit on Bugsy Siegel, and Meyer Lansky arranges it. And that's how Bugsy Siegel ends up dead. And that's that story. But anyway, by the 60s, Lansky has become the principal finance manager for all of Cosa Nostra, which means he's handling all the money, that tells you a lot. All right. These mobsters, the quickest way to get dead in organized crime is to screw up when it comes to money, just like Bugsy Siegel did. And that's all they're about, is making money. Business is business, right? They'll kill you in a heartbeat if you're standing in the way of them making money. So Meyer, who is not Italian, he's not one of them, so to speak, but he's so skilled when it comes to money that they trust him with all their money. And he's laundering their money, he's making them money, and he's already shown that he's really good with organization, organizing the five families in New York, helping with that, and creating a syndicate that is extremely profitable. He himself was involved in drug smuggling, pornography, prostitution, extort, all the vices that are, stereotypical mafia-related lines of, areas of business. So, and he's operating out of Miami. Now, where it gets even more interesting is this S Force. Now, I did several episodes on the S Force in my Conspirator One series. So if you really want to get, I'll give you in this episode a kind of a peek into what the S Force was about, but I won't get too in depth. If you really want the in depth version, go watch Conspirator One, that series, and I lay it all out, but including the sources, Daniel Sheehan, the attorney, Santos Trafficante, the client. This is all coming from the inside. And the reason, and I'll just quick tell you, the reason we know about the S Force and how it all worked is because of what happened after Watergate. You say Watergate, that's 10 years later, 12 years later. Yeah. Yeah. That's how long these covert operations were working. And usually it was the same people, the same operators, the same way of paying them, everything was the same. It had been working for so long. Why stop it? And Watergate stopped it. Bottom line was, if you know the story of Watergate, 4 of the 5 Watergate burglars were Cuban, and they came from Miami. And so the attorneys in F. Lee Bailey's law firm, representing James McCord, wanted to know why their guy, James McCord, was with 4 Cubans from Miami. And what were these Cubans doing up in the DNC headquarters in Washington, D.C. anyway? And of course, F. Lee Bailey knew because he had one other client. And his other client, that was very important anyway. He had other clients, but this client he knew specifically had knowledge about this, why these Cubans would be coming up from Miami, participating in this plumber's burglary of the DNC headquarters. And so he went to his other client. Guess who his other client was? It was Santos Trafficante. And he knows if there's any Cubans coming up out of Miami to participate in anything illegal, they're mafia related. They're anybody in Florida who's Cuban is mafia, and anybody who's in Florida who's Cuban and mafia is in Santos Trafficante's crime family. They're part of his organization. They're his people. They're his foot soldiers. So F. Lee Bailey says, well, we need to talk to Santos and find out about these 4 Cubans that have been arrested at Watergate. Why were they there? What was their purpose? Who are they? Blah, blah, blah. So in the process of finding out about these Watergate burglars, Santos Trafficante says, well, the story really starts back in 59 and 60. If you really want to know the whole story, I'll tell you the whole story. Of course, again, he's talking to an attorney. They have attorney-client privilege. And so he's telling F. Lee Bailey and Daniel Sheehan, who's one of the attorneys there, the source or the roots of the story going all the way back to 5960. And it was this S Force. And the S Force was literally created by Richard Nixon when he was vice president, head of the 5412 Committee, which is the covert arm of the CIA. He, in order to win the election against Kennedy, wanted to kill Castro and get credit for it. But Operation 40 wasn't working quick enough. So he, off the books, went and contacted Howard Hughes, who had been a major financier of his campaigns in the past. They were friends. He'd been involved in the national security apparatus of our country with inventing the Spruce Goose and all these different vehicles that would be used to retrieve submarines, Russian submarines that sank to the bottom of the ocean, et cetera, et cetera. Howard Hughes was like Elon Musk before Elon Musk. And he and Nixon were buddies. And so he went to Howard Hughes. Howard Hughes passed the word down the line, the future president. Everybody was operating under the assumption that Nixon was going to be the next president. So he goes to his attorney, Robert Mayhew, says, the future president wants to create this assassination team. So Robert Mayhew says, well, of course, if we're going to do that, we're going to have to use Cubans. If we're going to use Cubans, that means one place, Miami. That means they're under Santos Traficante's control. That means they're mob. We're going to have to use mobbed up Cubans to do it. You can't send white guys from Chicago down to Cuba to assassinate Castro. You got to send Cubans. So Robert Mayhew contacts his mob liaison, Johnny Rosselli, out there in Las Vegas, which is where Howard Hughes lives. And Johnny Rosselli says, well, if we're going to do this, I got permission from my boss, who is Sam Giancana. So he goes to his boss. Sam Giancana says, well, if we're going to do this, we got to use Santos's people. And it's going to be a hit in Santos's territory down in Cuba. So we got to get Santos's permission. So they arrange a meeting with Santos Traficante. And eventually, Santos says, well, if we're going to do this, I want to know it's coming straight from the top. So I want somebody, I trust all you guys to a point. We do business together. But if this goes south, if this goes bad, and my people get arrested or my people get exposed, that exposes me, not you. Not you, Sam Giancana up there in Chicago. Not you, Johnny Rosselli. Not you, Howard Hughes or Robert May, but me. So I want assurance this is coming from the top, which means he'll move heaven and earth to cover all this up if it ever goes south. So the very next meeting, which we're going to talk about next, at the Fontainebleau Hotel down in Miami, of course, it's always in Miami, is with Nixon's representative, Sheffield Edwards, who is the director of security at the CIA. And that is Nixon's rep to Santos to say, it's coming from me. You can't put Nixon at a table with Santos Traficante. You just can't do that. He's running for president, for Pete's sake. So he sends his emissary, his intermediary, Sheffield Edwards. And that convinces Santos Traficante, okay, this is coming from the top. And it sort of shows you what everybody thinks about the election at that point. They're meeting with the future president. That's what they think. So this is going to be green. This is coming straight from the White House. So that is the beginning of the S-Force. Santos Traficante recruits his own people, puts them on this assassination team. It's called the S-Force after Santos. And of course, you got CIA people that are training them. You got training bases where they're spread out in Operation 40 training bases, and they get flown once in a while down to Mexico to train, et cetera, et cetera. It's a whole big thing. Okay, like I said, if you want to hear all the details, go to my Conspirator 1 series. It's all in there, right? But when it comes to paying these people, they involve, of course, Meyer Lansky. He handles all the books, right? He handles all the finances. So the way that the S-Force is going to be paid, all the logistics are going to be paid for, and all the CIA operators and pilots, et cetera, are going to be paid is from cash from these mob-owned casinos and hotels in Las Vegas, primarily the Desert Inn and the Sands Hotel. This cash is going to be transported by suitcase, and it's going to be put in the trunks of Cadillacs. These Cadillacs are going to drive from Las Vegas to New Orleans, whereupon Carlos Marcello, who is the boss in New Orleans, will inventory all the cash, put it back in the trunks, in the suitcases, and then it'll all end up down in Miami at Lansky's Miami National Bank, whereupon Lansky will then wire all this money to the International Credit Bank in Geneva, Switzerland, and then it'll be transferred again from the International Credit Bank in Switzerland to the Banco Internacional in Mexico City. And from that bank, they had an attorney down in Mexico City. His name was Manuel Aguirre, and he would write all the checks to all the S-Force operators, the assassins, the trainers, the logistical support, everything, the pilots, and that's how they paid it out. And Lansky ran all that. So it's interesting, just another tie-in to Watergate. One of the Watergate burglars, Bernard Barker, was caught when he was arrested, and they pulled a check out of his pocket. It was from the Banco Internacional. And it's the same account. This is in 72. This is 12, 13 years later. And this is why Nixon lost his mind when he found out that the FBI number 2 guy, who later turned out to be the deep throat guy, one of them, said, I'm going to go down to Mexico City and check out the source of this money. I'm going to check out this bank account. And Nixon really wasn't concerned about Watergate, but he was really concerned about that check and that account because he knew how long that check and that, or how long that account had been used to do all these covert operations going back to this assassination team back in 60. They had been doing this for all these years. And Watergate was just another in a long series of covert operations that Nixon and CIA had been involved in. And he was more scared of that than he was Watergate itself. And he was also concerned about who had gotten arrested and where that would lead. E. Howard Hunt, Frank Sturgis, people like that. But anyway, the links from starting with when you create the S Force, and Meyer Lansky creates this elaborate scheme to pay all these people through this Banco Internacional in Mexico City, continues all the way to Watergate 72. These operations were all by the same people, by the same operators, handled in the same way, led by the same people. It was all one long ancestral operation with a series of smaller operations in between. It's unbelievable. Anyway, Meyer Lansky's handling all this money. He's invested in legal businesses such as hotels and golf courses. And this is one of the obsessions. You see this in the Godfather movie, right? Michael Corleone keeps telling his girlfriend and wife to be, in 5 years, 10 years, whatever, the Corleone family will be completely legitimate, to achieve that social standing, to get free of the Justice Department harassment, whatever. Really, it was another way to launder money as well. And Meyer Lansky had created this nest egg that was estimated to be about $300 million. No, we have no way of knowing for sure. It's not like they did tax returns and things of that nature, but estimated to be $300 million. So Meyer Lansky was a mover and a shaker. In some ways, even though he's not a boss, he's more important than the bosses because he's handling all the money. And he's doing it all out of Miami. So organized crime in Miami. So far, we got Santos Trafficante, who is the boss of bosses. If you're the CIA and you're trying to overthrow Castro, you're trying to assassinate Castro, or you're Richard Nixon and you want to assassinate Castro as vice president, head of the super secret 5412 committee, which boss helps you the most? Sam Giancana out of Chicago? Carlos Marcello out of New Orleans? Any of the 5 bosses in New York? Peter Licavoli in Detroit? Or Santos Trafficante in Miami, in Florida? It's Santos because his people are Cuban. He's Cuban. All right, so again, you can't infiltrate Cuban society with a bunch of white guys from Detroit. You've got to use the Cubans down in Florida. And of course, they're motivated. All you got to do is tell them we're going to assassinate Castro, and they're ready to sign up to do it immediately. And these are Santos's people. So this is why I say you got this entangling relationships where 3 entities are really just one: CIA, mob, Cubans. Because the CIA is going to partner with the mob. And of course, specifically the ones out of Miami and Florida, because they're all Cuban. And they together are going to work to carry this off. Now, the CIA is probably going to be paying the bills, but not all the bills. Meyer Lansky, right here, this cash is to pay the S-Force is coming from mob-owned casinos. And he's a mob guy who's laundering all this cash. But this is technically a CIA operation, the S-Force. But the mob's paying the bills. And so you see that, and it's all these Cubans that are going to be put on this S-Force. They're all Cuban. In that S-Force, one of those episodes that I did where we're talking about the S-Force, I listed the original 15 S-Force members that Santos recruited, all Cubans. 3 of them end up at Watergate, getting arrested at Watergate. It's the same people. So anyway, that's a pretty strong Miami connection there to what's fixing to happen with with these operations against Castro, which later gets turned against Kennedy, all coming out of Miami. Another representative, organized crime in Miami, is Johnny Rosselli. Now, he has a similar story to Meyer Lansky in that he got involved in organized crime back in the 20s. And then, of course, he is Italian, so he can rise through the ranks. He became a senior crime boss in Las Vegas with close ties to Meyer Lansky. He was sort of the guy that the mafiosos sent out to Las Vegas to keep track of all their money and all their construction projects out there. He was the eyes and ears of all these mafia bosses, specifically out of Chicago and Miami, keeping tabs on these big projects. In 1947, 2 years after World War II, the FBI, and this is J. Edgar Hoover, right? The same J. Edgar Hoover that said, there's no such thing as a mafia. There's no such thing as Cosa Nostra. There's no such thing as organized crime. Trying to cover for the leverage that they had on him, which goes back to gambling debts and also his homosexual lifestyle. So he's always covering for the mafia. But secretly, he knew. That's why, I mean, he had these wiretaps. We just talked about the wiretaps he had on Santos Trafficante. He knows what they are. He knows who they are and what they represent. They had identified, the FBI had identified Johnny Rosselli as a leading figure in the mafia and a close associate of Santos Trafficante. So he's not just associated with Meyer Lansky and all the financial parts of the investments that he's protecting for Meyer Lansky out in Las Vegas. He's not just connected to Sam Giancana. He's also connected to Santos Trafficante. So when President Eisenhower and Nixon, as his vice president in 1960 March, approve a CIA plan to overthrow Fidel Castro, they're going to make the same determination that the CIA had made earlier when they're going to make the same determination that the way to do this is to involve the help of the Cubans down in Florida, who all happen to be Santos Trafficante's people, which means the mob. So if we're going to assassinate or overthrow Castro, we need the Cubans, which means we need the mob, which means we need Santos Trafficante. And it's the same calculus that Nixon had made or will make when he's trying to create the S-Force. I got to have Cubans, and the Cubans are in Florida are all Santos's people, which means, and he's mob, which means I got to have Cuban mob figures. I got to have Santos's help. So I tell you, I cannot overstate the importance of Santos Trafficante and the Miami connection to all things related to CIA or U.S. government plots to overthrow Castro or assassinate Castro, which later morphed into plots or conspiracy to assassinate JFK. It's all coming out of Miami. Why? Because that's where Santos has his organization. That's where all these foot soldiers, these Cuban foot soldiers are located. That's where all these Cuban refugees are located that are extremely motivated, military-aged male figures that want to overthrow, put these armies together to overthrow Castro, kill him, so they can go home. It's all about Santos and his people. They're going to have to use, unless we're going to declare war against Cuba, in which case we don't need Santos. But this is all supposed to be covert. This is all supposed to be under the table. And so this is why Miami and Santos and the Cubans are going to be so key in all this. This is that famous meeting I was telling you about. Now, they had several meetings. This is the one where Sheffield Edwards shows up. So you see pictured here, if you're looking at the picture in the red circle, that is Johnny Rosselli. So he's the liaison that's putting this meeting together. To his left, but if you're looking at the picture to the right, that's Robert Mayhew. That's Howard Hughes' attorney. To Johnny Rosselli's left or right, but if you're looking at the picture, it'd be to our left. That is the guy leaning over. That is Sheffield Edwards. That is the director of CIA security. Behind these three, not pictured, are Santos Trafficante, Sam Giancana, the two mobsters. And they're all meeting at this Fontainebleau Hotel in Miami, of course. This is when Nixon has proposed the idea of the S-Force. And I took you through the whole story. And this is an off-the-books assassination plot to kill Castro before the election to help Nixon win the election. He wants him killed before November. And this is June, so it's got to happen quick. And of course, you remember the story now. Santos says, well, I need proof that this is coming from Nixon. So at this meeting, this ultimate meeting, this final meeting, Sheffield Edwards shows up to assure Santos Trafficante that this has come from the White House. And based on the agreement reached at this meeting, Santos creates the S-Force of his people with the understanding that it's coming from the White House and it'll be covered up. The CIA, the White House will go to the mattresses to cover this up because these assassins that are being put on this S-Force are Santos's people, but he's recruiting them back from Operation 40, which means they've been on the payroll of the CIA for the last few years. So Santos is no dummy. He doesn't recruit people that are strictly his. He recruits people that have been working for the CIA that basically he's been loaning to the CIA for the last few years so that it'll force the higher-ups to protect their identities should this ever become public. It's one of the reasons why the JFK assassination was why the Warren Commission was such a cover-up order. They could never delve into the Miami connection, the Cuban connection, the mob connection, because all of this would be revealed. And they couldn't reveal it. They had to cover it up. So anyway, this is that famous S-Force meeting. Executive action, by the way, is any action taken against a foreign head of state. We learned in the church hearings in the 70s that the CIA had all these active plots to kill foreign heads of state. They called it executive action. That was Nixon's sort of private little enterprise there, the S-Force. They also simultaneously, the CIA was initiating talks through Rosselli and Sam Giancana this time in a on-the-books operation or partnership. This was the executive action program to assassinate Fidel Castro. So you have two things going simultaneously. You have Nixon to the S-Force, his private little assassination force. He went through private individuals. He picked up the phone, called Howard Hughes. Howard Hughes talked to his own personal attorney, Robert Mayhew. Mayhew recruited Johnny Rosselli, who is a mob liaison with the CIA and the mob. And then they go and get Sam Giancana, Santos Trafficante. The only official person involved in all this is Sheffield Edwards. Because this is covert, it's classified, it can never be revealed. This is Nixon's private little attempt to assassinate Castro before November of 60 so he can win the election. Simultaneous, we have another program that's on the books, and that's the one that's called executive action. And that's when the CIA initiated talks with Rosselli and Sam Giancana to create a partnership between the CIA and the mob to kill Castro. And this is another meeting. This is about a year later, March 12, 1961. William Harvey actually meets in the same hotel. They don't even move the location. They just always have these meetings at the Fontainebleau Hotel in Miami. And at this meeting, William Harvey arranges for Jim O'Connell, who is a CIA operative, to meet the same people, Sam Giancana, Santos Trafficante, Johnny Rosselli, Robert Mayhew again. And this is when he gives them poison pills and $10,000 cash. O'Connell brings that with him, gives it to Rosselli, and this is supposed to be used to assassinate Fidel Castro. About this time, Rosselli gets wind of the fact that Meyer Lansky has his own assassination plot with it was like $1 million reward that he was willing to pay for somebody to assassinate Castro. Now, remember now, Castro, by kicking out the mafia, was costing the mafia about $100 million a year of lost income that they couldn't earn since they were no longer in Havana. This is a lot of money. So a $1 million bounty to kill Castro is nothing compared to the $100 million that they were losing by not being in. And so according to some of the sources I've listened to, Meyer Lansky and Chauncey Holt being the one of them. Chauncey Holt said this in his interview that Meyer Lansky was this close to succeeding in assassinating Fidel Castro, but got talked out of it by Rosselli, who said, listen, instead of you being on the hook paying $1 million, look, the CIA's trying to kill him. Richard Nixon's trying to kill him. Now, by this time, in 61, Nixon lost the presidency. He's no longer in charge. But the S-Force still exists. The S-Force is still out there training to kill Castro. Meanwhile, you have the CIA also involved in an operation, executive action, to kill Castro. So Rosselli goes to Meyer Lansky and says, why don't you call off your operation, save yourself, ultimately save all of us $1 million, and let's just let the CIA do it. Or the S-Force. You don't need to do it. And looking back on it, Chauncey Holt actually said the one who would have actually succeeded in killing Castro would have been Meyer Lansky, because Santos Trafficante was not privy to what Meyer was up to necessarily. Santos Trafficante and his dual responsibility as a double agent for Castro was reporting back or spying on the American government. He was spying on the CIA and telling Castro everything the CIA and the American government was up to, which is why all the assassination attempts coming from the CIA never worked. Why a Bay of Pigs never worked. Because Santos was spying and telling Castro what was up. But Santos didn't know what Meyer was up to. And Chauncey Holt said if Rosselli had just let Meyer Lansky continue on, he would have had Castro assassinated. But he intervened and said, let's let the CIA do it. And, you could go into a million little scenarios there as to maybe Rosselli knew, maybe Santos knew that Meyer was going to do something and probably would succeed. And so he and Rosselli persuaded Meyer to call it off so that he could continue to act as, or have that conduit, that he could continue to act as that double agent with Castro. If Castro dies, Santos, loses that. Maybe he's being paid. I don't know. I don't know what. Maybe as a result of him giving all this information to Castro, Castro was allowing Santos to secretly operate in Cuba and make all this money, and not have to worry about the competition from his partners, Sam Giancana, Carlos Mar, all these other New York people, whatever. I don't know. But it's interesting that somebody within the plot to kill Castro actually talked Meyer Lansky out of killing Castro, and that probably was the plot that would have succeeded. So it's almost like they secretly wanted Castro to stay alive. They had vested interest in Castro remaining alive, and the only way they could do that is if the plots came from the CIA and the American government, and they were involved in them, so they could report them back to Castro, so Castro could stay alive, basically. So, could survive these plots. So that's an interesting little sidelight. All these little dynamics at play here, even within the organization that's all trying to kill him. They at some point, I think leverage comes into play, and some of these operators realize there's more to be gained by Castro remaining alive and us having leverage over the CIA and what they're up to than there is to allowing Castro to die. We lose our leverage. So I don't know. You could go in a million different directions there, but so here you see all these different operations to kill Castro going on simultaneously. Then you have ZR Rifle, which is an entirely separate one. Another assassination program, another official CIA assassination program. This is the next year. So in June of 60, Nixon starts the S-Force. In March of 61, the CIA starts executive action to kill Castro. And then in April of 62, William Harvey takes control of another CIA project called ZR Rifle and informs Rosselli that Santos Trafficante and Sam Giancana had to cease involvement in the project to kill Castro. In other words, we're calling off, okay, everything that we've been doing trying to kill Castro, it's off. If you read the uh, the documents, the creation documents of the ZR rifle project, they lay it. William Harvey lays it right out because he's the one that wrote the document. Uh, all efforts, all other efforts, are going to cease and desist at this point, and we're going to focus on this new target. Now, the ZR rifle, where ZR rifle is different from executive action and the S Force, is that it's focused on an American target, whom they specify as a threat to world peace, an American target. And instead of using criminals to kill foreign heads of state, i.e., mob guys, we're going to use CIA assets to kill an American target. So people get these two assassination programs, they conflate them as being one and the same. They're not one and the same. Executive action was a CIA program to kill foreign heads of state, to use foreign criminals to kill foreign heads of state. The ZR rifle, which was created a year later, is to use CIA assets, in other words, internal, to kill an American target. And so when ZR rifle starts, William Harvey spreads the word, tells Johnny Russell, you need to pass the word along to your people that the executive action is off right now. And this is when Ted Shackley, the head of JM Wave, which is the Operation Mongoose headquarters in Miami on the South Campus of Miami University, also began to play a more important role in planning the assassination, because William Harvey worked out of the JM Wave station, and Ted Shackley's over the JM Wave station. So he's William Harvey's boss. And so eventually, Johnny Russell becomes convinced that the Cuban Revolution, you're not going to get rid of this revolution has taken over in Cuba by just getting rid of Castro. There's all these other people. However, they did continue to play along with the CIA plot to prevent them from being prosecuted. So what that means is they had been partners with the CIA in this, so they pretended going forward to continue to be partners, even though they realized themselves just getting rid of Castro is not going to change Cuba like we thought. It's like a cancer. It's metastasized. It's spread. Now, in February of '63, the following year, William Harvey ends up getting removed as head of the ZR rifle program because of his some of the things that the Kennedy brothers found out, and they send him to Italy to get him out of the way. And he becomes chief of station in Rome, and that's when Harvey becomes convinced that Bobby Kennedy has banished him and taking away his, Harvey was like the CIA's assassination specialist. He was involved in executive action, then he was involved in ZR rifle, and eventually Bobby Kennedy took him off ZR rifle, sent him to Italy to be the chief of station in Rome to get him out of the way because he was causing all kinds of problems. We'll talk more about that later. But the reason I'm bringing all this up is because Johnny Rosselli's in the middle of all of this, and he is the liaison between the CIA and Santos Traficante's family, organized crime family down in Miami. He is in the center of all of this effort to assassinate Castro, which later, and this S-Force, which is created by Nixon to assassinate Castro. Johnny Rosselli's fingerprints, just like Santos Trafficante, are all over all of this. Everywhere you see Johnny Rosselli, you see some kind of assassination program trying to take out Castro, whether it's the S-Force, whether it's executive action, whether it's ZR rifle, doesn't matter. He's not really involved in ZR rifle, but he knows William Harvey, who is in control of ZR rifle. But he's intricately involved in executive action. He's intricately involved in the S-Force. And of course, because he's operating out of Miami with Santos Trafficante, he's intricately involved in Operation Mongoose, which is being run out of Miami, the JM Wave station at the South Campus of Miami University. So what I'm trying to paint a picture here is that Miami is like the hub of all of these concurrent operations to overthrow and or assassinate Castro. And Santos Traficante is involved, which means all the Cubans are involved. And Meyer Lansky is involved. He's the one who's the paymaster. He's handling all the money for the S Force, right? Uh, and then you've got Johnny Rosselli, who's the liaison between Washington and all these different crime families, and ultimately Santos Traficante and all these operations involving the Cubans. It's all coming out of Miami. Santos, Meyer, Johnny Rosselli. And of course, you got Ted Shackley, who's running Operation Mongoose from the JM station in Miami, and his subordinate, William Harvey, who's involved in executive action and simultaneously involved in ZR Rifle. And he's operating out of Miami. So you have not just organized crime, you got CIA people. I mean, Miami is like its main industry at this point in time is overthrowing or assassinating Castro. Harvey continued to be in contact with Johnny Rosselli going forward. According to Richard Mahoney, who wrote a good book on this topic, quote, on April 8th, Rosselli flew to New York to meet with Bill Harvey. Bill Harvey's pictured here at the top. A week later, the two men met again in Miami to discuss the plot in greater detail. On April 21, Harvey flew from D.C. to deliver 4 poison pills directly to Rosselli, who got them to Tony Verona and hence to Havana. That same evening, Harvey and Ted Shackley, the head of JM Wave, pictured here, bottom left, several pictures of him, the chief of the CIA's Miami, they drove a U-Haul truck filled with arms through the rain to a deserted parking lot in Miami. They got out and handed the keys to Rosselli. So here you see Harvey and Rosselli working together. Again, in a plot to kill Castro. Now, this is before ZR Rifle begins, and Harvey passes the word along to Rosselli. Okay, cease and desist on all the efforts to kill Castro at this point. We're going after an American target using CIA people. But during this period of time, Rosselli, and Miami seems to be the place where they meet and they do all their, you see here, they met in Miami to discuss the plot. Then Ted Shackley was involved. He's head of the Miami base. He and Harvey together from Miami dropped this truck off at a deserted parking lot in Miami. They got out and they handed the keys to Rosselli. And from there, Rosselli takes over. So all of this is happening out of Miami. And you can see the close working relationship here between mob guys and CIA guys. I think that's the upshot of this. You see Bill Harvey, Ted Shackley, these are CIA vested people. They're officers. Right? These are not people that can be disavowed by the CIA. No, they never worked for us. These are Cubans. These are Santos's people. No, these are CIA people working with the mob liaison, Johnny Rosselli, who is in turn working with Santos Traficante. So in essence, they're all working together. They're all working together out of Miami. In 63, November, now we're up to the time frame where JFK was assassinated. Rosselli traveled to Florida with a male friend and 2 women. Now, this is a picture of Tosh Plumley here. He's a CIA pilot who ends up ferrying the S-Force around. According to Tosh Plumley, the pilot, he picked up Rosselli from Tampa on November 21st and took him to New Orleans. And after he picked up several more men, Plumley took Rosselli and his friends to Garland, Texas, where Rosselli and some others got off. Then they proceeded to Redbird Airport in Dallas. And in 1992, in April, in an interview, Plumley claimed that he was told that the objective of Rosselli and his friends was to, quote, abort the assassination of JFK. Plumley flies them into Dallas, Redbird Airfield. And this is how we know Rosselli was in Dallas on the day JFK died. So here is this guy who's been operating in conjunction with 2 different assassination plots to kill Castro. First, S-Force Second, executive action. And he's been working with William Harvey and Ted Shackley, who are over another assassination program, this one against an American target, a threat to world peace, using CIA personnel, called ZR Rifle. And they're all operating out of Miami. And on the day of the JFK assassination, they're all, well, not all of them, but several of the key ones are in Dallas. Tosh Plumley, the pilot, says, I flew Johnny Rosselli to Dallas. We landed at Redbird Airfield, and he told me the reason he was there was to abort the assassination of JFK, which means they're aware of a plot now to kill the president, and they have been sent in to abort. They're like an abort team, which was cover. All right, it was cover. But these are the same people that have been working for the CIA and for Santos and the mob and using all these Cubans to assassinate Castro. They're now, all of a sudden, on the day JFK is assassinated, they're in Dallas. Johnny Rosselli was one of the original planners and organizers of the S-Force. So here we start to see this assassination team that Nixon put together in 1960 to kill Castro in Dallas on the day JFK was assassinated. Now, the assassination team only exists for one purpose, and that is to assassinate somebody, a target. All right. And when you start to get into this, it'll be a lot more than just Johnny Rosselli, but he's the first one that we know of that was an S-Force participant, a planner, an organizer. All the way back when Nixon put it together in 1960, happens 3 years later in November, 3.5 years later, he's in Dallas on the day JFK is. And not just him. How about the pilot, Tosh Plumley? This is the pilot that flew the S-Force around from their training bases and Operation Mongoose bases that were spread all over Florida and New Orleans. They would get flown across the border into Mexico to train. Who did all that flying? Tosh Plumley. So here we have a second S-Force member in Dallas on the day JFK was assassinated, self-admitted in an interview in April of 1992, and given the cover while we were there to abort the assassination. That's not what the S-Force was trained to do. They were not trained to abort assassination attempts. They were specifically trained. I mean, when you really want to be specific about it, they were specifically trained to operate as 3 teams, to triangulate the fire, to shoot at a moving target from distance with high-powered rifles and scopes, because they couldn't get close to Castro. This is their training. Anybody want to guess how JFK was assassinated? A moving target from distance, high-powered rifles with scopes, triangulated fire. First shot took him in the throat from the front. Second shot took him in the back. It's a back shot. Third shot in the side. That's 3 different locations. Front, side, back. Triangulated hit. S-Force. And here are, and these people, they're all operating out of Miami. Santos's people, S-Force, are not just working with each other, but they're working with the CIA. William Harvey, Ted Shackley operating out of that Miami base, JM Wave. Now they're in Dallas on November 22nd, 1963. Wow. All right, here's another organized crime figure operating out of Miami. And this is a pretty well-known connection between him and Richard Nixon. In 1951, he was first introduced to Richard Nixon by George Smathers. And of course, a year later, Nixon is appointed by Eisenhower to be his vice president. George Smathers says, quote, Beebe's level of liking Nixon increased as Nixon's position increased. So think about that. In 51, he meets Nixon. Nixon is just a senator at this point, which is a powerful friend to have. But a year later, he's the vice president. So what Smathers is saying is all of a sudden, Beebe Rebozo sees a whole new level of potential in this friend of his, Richard Nixon. Rebozo's wife said, quote, Beebe's favorites are, quote, Richard Nixon, his cat, and then me. She's complaining. He likes Nixon more than he does me. One of Rebozo's friends, Jake Jernigan, says, quote, he loved Nixon more than he loved anybody. Another friend said that Beebe worshiped Nixon and hated Nixon's enemies. So what happens is Beebe Rebozo meets Nixon. George Smathers makes the introduction when Nixon's on the ascendancy. He's just starting, he's become pretty popular because of the HUAC hearings, the House Un-American Activities Committee. He's the one that went after the Russian spy and everything, and he establishes himself in the minds of the American people as this anti-communist crusader. And even though he's young, he's a star in the Republican Party, so much so that Eisenhower picks him to be his VP. And this connection that he made with Beebe Rebozo just flourishes at that point because he's on the way up. He's a shooting star. He's going to serve with Eisenhower for 8 years as VP, probably then translate that into a presidency of his own for the next 8 years. So if you're Beebe Rebozo and you're looking for someone to have a connection with, powerful friends, Nixon's your guy. And so Rebozo, and this is documented, this isn't anything that's hidden. You had to fill out campaign finance reports and things. Rebozo helped Nixon obtain large campaign contributions from Howard Hughes. Now, Howard Hughes, as you remember, is the guy Nixon will go to in 60 to help him set up the S-Force. And that relationship had been nurtured or created by Beebe Rebozo. And then as a result of both of these men, Beebe Rebozo and Howard Hughes, seeing the potential and having a powerful friend, ally in the White House named Richard Nixon, they all start pouring money into his campaign coffers. Rebozo also advised Nixon about business investments. According to an FBI informant, Beebe Rebozo and Nixon had both invested in Cuba back when Batista was in charge. Now, this throws into doubt or throws into question the Eisenhower policy towards Castro. As you remember, once he realizes that Castro has taken over and Castro is cozying up with the Soviets and he's not giving access to American companies in Cuba like he had before, he puts an embargo on Cuba, and it's always blamed on Eisenhower, but it really calls into question whether this was Eisenhower leading this effort or whether this was Nixon. Because Nixon's the one, as Eisenhower's vice president, that has the business investments in Cuba that are now in jeopardy because Batista, America's puppet, is no longer in charge. Castro's in charge. There's a famous meeting you see there in that picture in that Cuban Connection book where Nixon and Castro are meeting, and Castro is being told by Nixon that you can't have any relations with the Soviets. If you do, you're going to have a problem with the Americans. And Castro basically tells Nixon, hey, listen, I'm the president of Cuba. It's a sovereign nation. We're not going to be ordered around by the United States. And it was at that point that Nixon comes home and orders Operation 40 to begin these covert operations against Castro and his government. So it makes you wonder if the American policy towards Cuba isn't more led by Nixon, the vice president, than it is by Eisenhower, the president, because Nixon had personal investments that he and Beebe Rebozo had invested in Cuba while Batista was in charge. Rebozo had considerable business investments in the Caribbean region. He became one of the leading opponents of Castro after he gained power in Cuba. Well, Rebozo is one of Nixon's closest friends, one of his biggest campaign contributors. Rebozo had a business partner named Hope Maroon, who claimed that Nixon was also part owner of the Coral Gables Motel near Miami. Nixon famously cried poor all the time. And if you look at his tax returns, he was like the poorest vice president, later became president, poorest president we ever had, poorest vice president. He always cried poor. So it leads one to wonder through this Beebe Rebozo contact down in Miami, who helped him invest in this motel in Miami, who helped him invest in Cuba, and all these different. and this relationship that he had with Bebe Rebozo, who himself had all these investments in Cuba, who was affiliated with Howard Hughes, who had all kinds of an axe to grind against Fidel Castro himself. If Castro, or if Nixon was not the one leading this anti-Castro policy, American policy, in 59 and 60, to help his friends, to help himself, to protect whatever financial investments he himself had down there. It makes you wonder. A couple books here, The Cuban Connection, talking about Nixon's close relationship with Bebe Rebozo, the mob, and how Castro jeopardized all that. The mafia's president, Nixon and the mob. It's always been a fascinating topic to me to wonder why the mob supported JFK in 60 for president when they already pretty much owned Nixon. Would they not benefit more from Nixon, a guy they already controlled and had leverage over, if they helped him win in 60 rather than Kennedy? But it's an interesting question. You know, if you're the organized crime, you have to look at these two and decide, okay, which one helps us the most? Nixon's already our guy. We got him. We know what we got with Nick. But here's where Kennedy becomes has the advantage as far as mob support. If Kennedy loses the 60 election and goes back to the Senate, that means he and Bobby will continue to be a pain in organized crime's side, because they'll continue to run these hearings out of the Senate, exposing organized crime, hauling these mafiosos in to testify. In other words, the McClellan Committee and all the things that are coming out of the Senate, which is harassing the organized crime syndicate in America, will continue if Kennedy loses, because he'll go back to the Senate and just pick up where he left off. And his brother is his lead attorney in that, and he'll just pick up where he left off. But if we can help them win the election, promote them to the White House, they cease to be a problem in our side, because that committee, since they were prominent members of it, we're now switching over from a Republican to a Democrat White House, and they'll have, especially if we agree to help them, and they agree to if you'll help us become president, you'll have a friend in the White House, that means they'll call off all of these investigations. They'll call off all these hearings. The McClellan Committee will go away. And he'll help us get rid of Castro. If Nixon wins, he'll help us get rid of Castro. But if Kennedy wins, he'll help us get rid of Castro and shut down all these McClellan hearings. The Democrats control Congress. So if Nixon wins, he won't have the power to shut down investigations in Congress, because the Democrats control Congress and he's a Republican. But if the Democrats win the White House and they control Congress, they can do two things. They can help get rid of Castro and they can shut down the investigation. So that's where organized crime makes the decision that we actually benefit more from a Kennedy administration than we do a Nixon administration, even though we control Nixon, which is why when Daddy Joe presents this deal to Sam Giancana goes for it. And guys like Jimmy Hoffa and Carlos Marcello, who hate Kennedy with a passion, have to go along because they're all partners. And they have to speak with one voice, right? Operate as together on this. And they have to at least swallow hard and go along with this, trying to get Kennedy. And they did. They got Kennedy elected. Nixon lost. But Kennedy didn't go through with his part of the deal. He didn't get rid of Castro, and he didn't shut down the investigations into organized crime. In fact, Bobby Kennedy accelerated the investigation, so they double-crossed the mob is what they did. This bottom picture is Nixon, again with Bebe Rebozo, down in Miami. In fact, it's interesting, when Watergate happened, when the burglary happened in 72, and Nixon got word of it, he had to rush home. He was in Miami at the time, hanging out with Bebe. He had to fly home to handle this crisis. So, my goodness, these Miami connections are deep to organized crime, starting with Santos and Meyer Lansky and Johnny Rosselli and now Bibi Rebozo, and not just to uh, Nixon. And starting with Nixon, and the connection is to Nixon when he's vice president between 52 and 60, but then fast forward from 68 to 72 or 74 when he's president. And in between, you have Kennedy, and he has his own connections to organized crime. And all of these people lead right back to Miami. It's unbelievable. In 1960, uh, Rebozo helped raise funds for Nixon's campaign against Kennedy. He also paid for an investigation into Kennedy. So this is interesting. Rebozo, even though organized, this is business, right? Rebozo has chosen Nixon as his sort of like he's going to be his host, right? Kind of like a parasite chooses a host. Bibi Rebozo is the parasite. He's picked Nixon as his host, and he's going to ride that horse as far as he will take him. Meanwhile, organized crime, other aspects of organized crime have chosen Kennedy as their horse, as their host, and they're going to ride him. And so you get these contrasting things, forces at work. Rebozo's helping Nixon. At the same time, his friends in organized crime are helping Kennedy. In 61, Rebozo actually accompanied William Pauley on a secret mission to see Dominican Republic dictator Rafael Trujillo. This was all about a secret plan to assassinate Fidel Castro. Before the CIA decides Rafael Trujillo is a problem, they get rid of him. And this Rebozo guy, he's from Miami. And so he's mixing with some pretty powerful people. He's supporting Nixon because Nixon is his host, and that's going to be his gravy train. And Nixon is still obsessed in 61, even though he's not president, with assassinating Fidel Castro. And so on, he's now representing a private citizen, Richard Nixon. He goes with William Pauley, who is another private citizen, and they go see Rafael Trujillo about continuing this secret plan to assassinate Fidel Castro at the behest of Nixon, of course. So what we see here, and I hope I haven't made it too complicated. I'm trying to keep it as simple as possible. Well, what we see here in episode 1, we see all these militant Cubans that are congregating in South Florida under the leadership of Santos Trafficante, because he's their mafia boss. He's like them, a refugee from Cuba, but he was their boss in Cuba. Now he's their boss in Miami and South Florida. And these are young men mostly, and they're just virulently anti-Castro. They'll do anything. They're motivated. They'll die for the cause. They hate Castro, okay? And initially they love Kennedy because Kennedy's saying all the right things. He's going to get rid of Castro. So they love Kennedy at first. Passion. That's the one word I would use to describe these people. They are very passionate about their cause. Now, passion can work for you, but it can also work against you. If someone is passionately in love with you, trust me, they can be if something triggers them just right, they can be passionately just as much against you. They can hate you just as much as they loved you. Passion. If they feel betrayed, if there's any point in there where they feel betrayed, that passion, which worked for you before, will now work against you. That's something to remember as we go forward, talking about these militant Cubans in Miami. At the same time, in episode 2, which we just did today, there are also a bunch of organized crime figures in Miami who are central to not just their own efforts, but to these Cuban militants, but also the CIA's efforts to get rid of Castro. And they're going to be enlisted to help with all these efforts to get rid of Castro. Some of these efforts, again, they're going to be very passionate for what they believe in too. You know, these organized crime figures is about money. Meyer Lansky lost a bunch of money. There are estimates that Meyer Lansky, you know, he had to flee Cuba for his life on like New Year's Eve or whatever when Fidel Castro took over. And he had to leave his bank accounts and everything behind, millions of dollars. He lost a ton of money, which is why he was trying to privately on his own put up a reward to kill Castro because he had a private beef with Castro. But organized crime had a big beef. They'd been kicked out. They were losing $100 million a year. So you got the militant Cubans who want to go home. You got these organized crime figures who want to go back to Cuba and make all this money instead of having to spend all this money to build another Cuba out in Las Vegas. They'd like to go back to Cuba and resume. And then you have the CIA, which would like to go back to business as normal. They were making all kinds of money from this heroin trade from the Golden Triangle, ended up, coming through Cuba into the United States. They would like to get rid of Castro. Nixon wants to get rid of Castro because he wants to win the election in 60. You had all these things, and all this is pushed or being energized by this passion. These militant Cubans hate Castro. They probably have brothers and sisters and family members who were executed by Castro. There is a hate there. And there's a love for Kennedy at this time because Kennedy's saying all the right things. There's a love for Nixon because whoever wins the presidency in 60s, they're both saying they want to get rid of Castro. So if you're these militant Cubans, you don't care if it's Nixon or Kennedy because both of them are going to help you get rid of Castro. Right? But if either one ever betrays you, that love will turn to hatred. Same thing with the mob. The mob makes this deal with the Kennedy people, with Joe Kennedy. And he's going to help them get rid of Castro. They're going to have a friend in the White House. And so they want to get back to Cuba almost as bad as the militant Cubans because they're losing all this money. They're very passionate about it. And they're very supportive of, at first, Nixon, but then they realize they're going to get more out of Kennedy. So then they become very supportive of Kennedy and early on because they're going to get something in return for this deal. And of course, the CIA, same thing. As long as whoever, either Nixon or if you're the CIA, you actually gain more by Nixon being the president because as vice president, he's been in charge of all these covert operations from 52 to 60. It'd be nice if the same guy was now the president for the next 8 years. You don't have to break in a new guy. But either way, if Kennedy ends up being president, he's so young and inexperienced. If he goes along with beta pigs and all things go well, we can basically run him like we've been running Nixon. And if at any point Kennedy or Nixon, anybody, either one of these guys, it's ironic, they both end up becoming targets. Kennedy ends up dead. Nixon ends up having resigned the presidency as a result of Watergate. He gets set up by the same people. So if at any point either one of these future presidents, ever turns against the CIA or says no to them in any of these things, then that passion to support them that worked for them will now work against them. And that's where we're headed with this. And they're all operating out of Miami. Miami is the key to this. It's where the militant Cubans are. It's where the organized crime figures are. It's where the CIA is going to be. We're going to be talking about that next. The JM Wave Station down in Miami, the largest base, anti-Castro base in America. And all these CIA operators, they're all mixed. They're all part of the same milieu. They're all part of the same environment. They're all in the same proximity. They're all rubbing shoulders with each other, and they all hate Castro. And that passion will drive them in one direction until they realize they've been betrayed by the guy that they thought was on their side. And then all of a sudden, that passion will turn against, it'll flip on its head, 180 degrees. So that's sort of where we're headed. And I hope I'm explaining it as clearly as I can. Miami this is where the decisions, this is where it's all operating from, right? The CIA base that we're going to talk about next is in Miami. So all decisions from Washington involving the CIA will involve Miami because that's where the base is. That's where the Cubans are. That's where the mob is. So all things anti-Castro will come out of Miami, which means in 3 years, when all this pivots and turns against Kennedy, it'll still be out of Miami. It's the same people. The same people. And then they'll throw in, well, maybe we'll get him in Chicago, maybe we'll get him in Tampa, maybe we'll get him in Dallas, whatever. That where they end up getting him is irrelevant. Not completely irrelevant, but it's not the main thing. The main thing is Miami. New Orleans becomes a nice little subplot how to set up Patsy, New Orleans, right? Lee Harvey Oswald. But where it all gets planned, where the conspirators all mix and mingle, where this is all hatched is Miami. So, all right, that's episode 2. Next episode, we'll start getting into some CIA people down in Miami. And we've already touched on a few, right? Ted Shackley, William Harvey, but there's more. So until next time, hope everybody has a great day. God bless.